When is language offensive? And even if language is offensive, should it be suppressed and should you face consequences for offensive language? I was drawn to these thoughts last evening, I have to tell you, contemplating the latest rhetoric of eco-activist Dr. Mike Joy, Joy, who's been on the show in actual fact, a long-time greenie critic of the dairy industry in particular, and farming in general, and a protagonist in the dairy farming versus freshwater debate that besets and has beset the Waikato, Taranaki, Canterbury and Southland regions in particular over probably the last decade. And he's been one of the leading lights against dairy farming in this country during that period. He's arguing that the excessive nitrate levels to make the grass grow is poisoning the water. That's the words he uses. And that is endangering public health. All right. And there's a general acceptance that there might be some credence to that in certain parts of this country. All right. Well, he's now a professor, apparently, according to Federated Farmers. I didn't know that, but I'll come to that in a second. Employed by Victoria University. And certainly there's an argument, and one used by Federated Farmers in the last 48 hours, that Stephen Joyce had faced some sanction for words that he's used. In this particular case, he tweeted out something, and I've always, I've got this problem with Twitter, and now it's X. People who are drunk regularly go on it, or they make the mistake of being sucked into the vortex of X because they read something and go, I respond to that immediately, and by the time they do, it's the old story that my grandmother used to tell, what things you can't take back, and one of them was the sped word. Well, Mike Joy must have been in his Victoria University Aerie in Wellington somewhere, contemplating the world and thinking, who can I piss off today? When he decided that he read a tweet. He read a tweet and he decided to respond to it. And it was to do with dairy farming in general. And he responded this way. And this is what he put out on public social media. Remember, he's an academic employed by Victoria University. Quote, unquote. Minnie Dean, and for those of you who don't know Minnie Dean, she was a famous baby killer, 19th century. Well, there's those that argue that she didn't really kill them. They just died, and she had a whole backyard full of them. But she was, if you had an unwanted child in the 19th century, and I'm pretty sure it was in Southland, Otago, Southland, wasn't it? You could give them to Minnie Dean on the basis that, well, maybe Minnie would find a new home for them. And the suggestion is Minnie found a home for them, all right. She throttled them and then she put them in the garden. So that was her home, and she got paid, presumably as a sort of baby, illegal. But in the end, she was hanged, actually. Anyhow, that's Minnie Dean, 19th century, New Zealand. Minnie Dean, said Mike Joy 2 days ago, was hung for killing babies in Southland, all right. But our dairy industry is currently putting babies and adults at risk with nitrate contamination of drinking groundwater. All right. And then here's the bit. How about we bring back hanging for industry CEOs? All right, so he was specifically thinking about dairy industry CEOs when he made that last comment. How about we bring back hanging for industry CEOs? Now, Federated Farmers in response started a bit of a campaign yesterday, day before him, the day before him, Federated Farmers, saying we have become a very pitiful and nasty little country, they said. And they highlighted this particular Twitter or X commentary from Dr. Mike Joy, frankly, to an audience that wouldn't have otherwise seen it. I'm always amused by that. People who get so offended by something they've got to duplicate or replicate it, and suddenly 10 times as many people have seen it as would have seen it in the first place anyhow. It might have just gone out there as a comment. Federated Farmers have now made it a national controversy. So it's a hanging analogy, all right, that Mike Joy has used. A version, I guess, of Shakespeare's Let's Kill All the Lawyers, which was a line in what, Henry IV, Part 2? although the speaker was deadly serious in that case, I think. And I think subsequently, over generations, dear Lord, over centuries, most people have uttered those words and not, ironically, let's kill all the lawyers. But is joy similarly serious? He says it was just an ironic comment, and obviously wasn't intended as a prelude to a public execution in Gore or Morrinsville or deepest, darkest Eltham or somewhere like that. But we've surely seen such rhetoric before, and the most obvious and recent case that I can think of that's more prominent was the anti-vax, but particularly the anti-mandate protests that were staged at Parliament, and some of those participating suggested that certain politicians should be at the end of a noose, and there's the difference. Now, I'm trying to remember where that protest was. It must have been, what, over 3.5 years ago? Was that right? I'm somewhere 2022. Honestly, all these things fade now, but 3.5 years ago. But it's the same rhetoric, in one case used by a series of people on the parliamentary lawn, suggesting that there are certain people who have taken away their jobs, and certain politicians and policymakers have taken away their jobs, their livelihoods, their freedoms, that they should face the hangman's noose. And then there's Mike Joy, well paid, well respected within the academic environment, one has to say, academic for Victoria University, making the same analogy 3.5 years later. And, well, there's the difference. There's the difference. And I'm not going to condemn Mike Joy any more than I'm going to condemn the anti-mandate protesters and their ironic suggestion of the Nuremberg trials or nooses being applied to politicians. I mean, it's rhetoric. It wasn't serious. It is anger speaking out, probably in both cases. In this particular case, actually, both Mike Joy and the anti-mandate protesters on the parliamentary lawn. But the difference is this. 3.5 years ago, there were a whole series of people from the Disinformation Project, which was just another Marxist-Leninist front at the end of the day, through to academics, through to mainstream media, through to politicians and policymakers and jurists, for God's sake, even, who condemned, cauterized, criticized those who used that kind of rhetoric 3.5 years ago, and suggested that essentially they were a threat and an affront to democracy and decency in this country, and in good part should actually face criminal charges for their rhetoric and their, if you like, leadership in trying to invade and invoke violent rhetoric into a political and social, and in that particular case too, cultural debate. Now, Mike Joy's done exactly the same. I'm not going to condemn him. So I don't join Federated Farmers in that. It was clearly an ironic comment. For God's sake, get over yourselves. In exactly the same way that I'm not going to condemn those who ended up and said that, Jacinda Ardern should swing from the end of a noose. And you might well argue that those who had that latter view, just quietly, were even angrier because in many cases they had lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their businesses, for making a choice that was, we all know now, even those of us like me who are triple vaxxers, even those of us who bought the rhetoric to start with, we all know now that the way, mind you, I did point that out at the time, even though I had been, that group of people that weren't should have been given that freedom of choice and shouldn't have been denied the liberties and shouldn't have been treated as second-class citizens and were effectively shunned by wider society, and nobody cared. And nobody did care. And that is the apology that is still waiting to be writ by one brave government, or at least somebody with a bit of decency to say, sorry, we got it wrong. But anyhow, the point was, it's the same side. It's just flip. It's just, that was the so-called right who were protesting and using that kind of rhetoric. This is the left, and an eco-activist like Dr. Mike Joy. Now, I'm not going to condemn either of them. I think this is freedom of speech. And I think freedom of speech sits by itself. So I think Federated Farmers campaign just quietly to have Mike Joy disciplined or in some way chided, or maybe even lose his job from Victoria University for this tweet, I think that goes way too far. And the the best way to think of free speech is that you're tested not by your own bias. So in other words, I don't mind, the anti-mandate people saying that, but I get really upset at Mike Joy saying that. Why? Or vice versa. It's when you need to give your enemies and those who you do not support your support that you're truly a follower of free speech. And in this particular case, can I say, federated farmers are trying to take away a liberty that frankly should not be denied. The irony of all this is that that comment by Dr. Mike Joy on Twitter or on X would have received very little coverage if federated farmers hadn't blown it into a major cause over the last 48 hours. And so just be careful of what you do, because there'll be a whole series of people who might now have seen something and agree with the general rhetoric of Joy that wouldn't have seen it ever before. But nonetheless, but I will condemn this, and this is what I am going to condemn. I'm not going to condemn either, as I said, the anti-mandate protesters for the rhetoric, nor am I going to condemn Dr. Mike Joy. It's clearly ironic at the end of the day. And frankly, anybody who takes it that seriously, federated farmers, after all, is bloody and woke Wellington, and dear Lord, that's a stultifying and suffocating environment for free speech. So maybe they've been infected and infested by that. Maybe. But I am going to condemn the fact that 3.5 years ago, a whole series of people were cauterized, criticized. In fact, even if they were associated with that particular protest, if you remember 3 years ago, Stuff and Radio New Zealand and a whole series of news media outlets were tracking down their candidacies standing for things as prosaic as a local council or a community board, and exposing them and knocking on their door and saying, oh, look, you were at that protest 3 years ago where violent rhetoric was used. You're standing down for political office. How dreadful. Remember that? That campaign that was run against those seeking local body positions because they just happened to be at the protest and agree that mandates weren't a good thing. They didn't necessarily ascribe to all the rhetoric, but it doesn't matter. They're associated with it. They should be cauterized, criticized, condemned, right? But Mike Joy gets a free pass. Now, again, I am not having a go at Mike Joy. I'm having a go at those in the media in particular, at Victoria University in general, who would have condemned, indeed fired somebody 3.5 years ago if they were in the anti-mandate lot from saying exactly what Mike Joy has just said now on his X. They'd been gone. Their feet would have not touched the ground, and they would have been publicly humiliated as they were placed into the waiting taxi with all of their goods in some sort of black rubbish bag and given to them and thrown into the back seat of that particular taxi. They would have been gone. But 3.5 years ago, if you say it on the left, it's fine, And so I guess that's where we need to be clear about. I'll defend the Mike Joys of this world any day of the week. I don't think that what he said was offensive at all. In fact, you're just taking that way too seriously. In exactly the same way that you took it far too seriously, suggesting that, basically Voices for Freedom and all their ilk should have been added to the schedule on the anti-terrorism bill, which was, I have to say, a live thought going through the political and media scene of Wellington in 2022. But just saying. And on that, and so you wouldn't have expected me to have a go at federated farmers, but can I just say, federated farmers, for God's sake, pick your battles, because this is not one. And when you start impinging upon freedom of speech, you're just as bad as those that decided that freedom of speech and thought and choice in that particular case should be denied 3 years ago.